North Africa, the Human Geography, Part 2. Okay, so let's move to, we've already discussed the cultural heritage of the region of North Africa, the Middle East, and now we'll get into a very brief overview of the history. We'll touch on some of the high points, but this area is extremely rich in history, so in no way can I do it justice in 15 minutes. I'm just hitting the high parts because we are constrained by time, or I'm hitting the parts that we have to cover for our curriculum. This is no way a conclusive study of the history of the Middle East. With that being said, let's take a look at this timeline. Jerusalem was the first settlement, or the first settlement of people, human beings, as far as evidence shows that human beings first started settling in Jerusalem between 4500 to 3500 BCE. This area right here is in Jerusalem. This is right approximately Jerusalem on the border of the Sinai Peninsula with Egypt, near the Mediterranean coast. So from about 1400 to about 1150 BCE, that's before Christ existed, Jerusalem, this area was under Egyptian control. And that makes sense because it is bordering Egypt, right on the Sinai Peninsula. About 10,000 BCE, we have the city of Jerusalem, or Israel, coming under Jewish control when King David from the Bible, conquered Jerusalem, and so around 1000 BCE. 37 BCE is where we see this area coming under the control of the Romans. 30 AD is the crucifixion, which the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, which this graphic represents. And 70 AD is what this picture represents, is the Jewish diaspora. What the Jewish diaspora is, once again, is when Jewish people were expelled from Jerusalem, and this occurred right around 70 AD, and this ended Jewish control of this region, and it became a Christian province. It was under Christian control from that time. Now, moving forward, and once again, this picture is just another illustration of what we can approximate today of the Jewish diaspora, what it actually looked like. And you can see some of the hieroglyphics in the background of the mass exodus of Jewish people leaving Israel and Jerusalem. So, and just kind of going back and explaining a little bit again, when the Romans conquered the Jewish kingdom in Palestine, Jews were expelled from the region. And once again, highlighting that, what we call this is the diaspora, okay, the dispersal of Jews from their homeland. So moving to the next concepts, we have a couple of them that we can go over really quickly. First, this particular region, Israel, has experienced numerous conflicts throughout history. And I guess a question for us to kind of think about, if you guys to think about before I reveal the answer, is what has been the cause of many of the conflicts of this region? Give you a second to think about it. See if you got it. Religion. The primary cause of, so if you have religion, you're correct, okay? So the primary cause of the majority of the conflicts in this region are religion. Remember, we'll get into this a little bit further in the video, but the three major monotheistic religions all have a claim to Jerusalem. They all have common ancestors, and because we all have common ancestors, we all come from Abraham. The three major monotheistic religions, they all have an equal claim to Jerusalem, or to Israel, to this land. And the next question we'll get into is what series of religious conflicts occurred in between the Christians and Muslims during the Middle Ages. I'll give you guys a couple seconds to think about it. The series and this conflict was when European Christians went to take the Holy Land back from Muslims. And this will be a review. Give you guys a couple seconds to think about it before I review it. Okay, let's see if you have it right. The Crusades. So remember that. The Crusades were a series of holy wars where Christians attempted to take Jerusalem and Israel back from Muslims. Now, let's move back and get back to the timeline and talk about, highlight some of the other events that occurred throughout the history of Jerusalem and Israel. Around 638 AD came under Islamic control. And from that time until about 1517, the Ottoman Empire, which is an Ottoman Empire, which is dynastic empire during that time, controlled Jerusalem. Around the 1800s, around the mid 1800s, when it was still Jerusalem was still under the control of the Ottoman Empire, we saw a large immigration of Jewish immigration back into Jerusalem. So we talk about the diaspora around 70 AD. A lot of the Jewish people from Israel were expelled. They were sent away. And about 1,700 years later, we start seeing migration of Jewish people back into Israel. So over the centuries, we're looking at various Muslim empires rose and fell. And by the late 1800s, the Western European countries and Russia imperialized most of the region. And what imperialism is, it's when one country dominates another country for political, social, and an economic way of life of another country. And what this picture does, this graphic actually is a way to summarize imperialism. Is actually showing the major powers of that time: Germany, British, Russia, colonizing or cutting apart the map of the part that they wanted for their country. So what countries did in the region stayed independent and did not fall under the control of European countries? Well, in North Africa and Southwest Asia and the Middle East, there were some of those countries. Egypt stayed independent. And after World War II in the 1950s through the 80s, Central Asia was in war with the Soviet Union around this time. So in the areas around Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Pakistan, they were engaged in war against the Soviet Union to maintain their independence because the Soviet Union was seeking to colonize them. And this war went on until about the 1990s, the early 1990s, until the fall of the Soviet Union. Back to the timeline. We go back, I want to call your attention back to this around the 1800s. We saw Jewish immigration back into Israel. And I guess it begs the question of what caused this Jewish immigration. Like, let's step back and think about it. What is it that we know about European history that we discussed a couple of months ago that would have caused Jewish people to leave the places in Europe, primarily where they settled, to go back to Israel? Well, two things. One is the religious prophecy, okay? The Jewish people believe that Israel was promised to them by God, that is their land and that they have a right to it. And so they always believe that even during the diaspora, that they would eventually go back and claim Israel. And this is a picture of Israel as it looks today. And the second reason is that, think about it, Jewish people, they immigrated to countries throughout Europe where they often face persecution. And you guys know what persecution is. It's just to harass or treat someone ill. And normally, and especially if you're mistreating someone because of their race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, or beliefs. Nazi Germany is probably the most famous example of persecution that the Jews faced while in Europe during World War II. And this picture is, of course, this is the German swastika. And this picture, this graphic is of Jewish people who from the concentration camps. So you can see not only religious prophecy, but persecution in Europe forced Jewish settlers to come back, or was a motivation for Jewish settlers to come back to Israel after being gone for almost 1,700 years. Now, after World War II, the United States, or the United Nations, the United States, Great Britain, the winners of World War II, Russia, France, and the United Nations, the rest of the countries of the world, they divided Palestine and Jerusalem and into separate Jewish and Arab states. So what they did is, because of the conflict and all of the rising Jewish settlers in the region was starting to outnumber the Arab settlers, the United Nations stepped in and they divided Palestine into a Jewish and Arab state. And what we had was the Jewish state of Israel and the migration of Jews back to the area. More Jewish people came after World War II because they considered this to be the homeland that was prophesied. So we had two states after this. It was Palestine's Arab state, and Israel was the primary Jewish state. And what I'll show you is, and after this did not prevent conflict in the area. Unfortunately, there were still many conflicts in that area. As you can imagine, if you were Arab living in this area and basically the area Jewish settlers came in and took it over, you would fight too. So, of course, the people who have been living there for the past 1,700 years were not happy with this at all. Even with the United States agreement in place, still numerous conflicts. So many Palestinian Arabs were forced out of their homes, becoming refugees. And we know what refugees are, people who have to leave their home for safety. And what happened is that the Jewish settlers had a superior military because the people of Palestine were basically people living pretty close to as traditional ways as possible. They did not have the advanced military of the recent Jewish settlers who came in with support from the United Nations. So we see, if you take a look at this graphic, as a result of the different armed conflicts, in 1946, the green represents the Palestinian-owned lands, which were the Arab settlers, versus the white, which is the Jewish settlers. So we see a continuance since 1946. The majority of Israel is green. This is the United Nations plan in 1947 to separate the green into the Arab or Palestinian state and the white into the Jewish state as a result of armed conflicts, though. Where the native people or the Palestinian people lost, the Arabs lost, Israel began to take land back from them as they won military victories. The people of Israel, and they had more people coming into Israel, more Jewish migrants immigrating back into Israel. They needed more land, and as a result of that, and conflict with Palestinians, you see the loss of Palestinian lands in the time between 1949 to 1967, to where these continuing losses to where you see today, where it's almost the opposite of where it started off 60 years ago. And these Palestinian people didn't go anywhere. They didn't do anything wrong. They didn't start a war. They just have, let me say this. Their land, they lost their land. They were not at war with anyone before losing their land. They were on their land. It's probably a situation I could say that is very similar to the Native Americans, what occurred here in the United States of America. And talking a little bit about, and that kind of talks about the Jewish, the Arab-Israeli conflict. On one side, we have Arabs or Muslims and Palestinians. And on the other side, we have Jewish people or Israelis. And there is an ongoing conflict between, as you can imagine, just by taking a look at the illustration in the last video, or the illustration a couple of minutes ago that showed the decreasing lands that the Palestinians who were living on that land, that the decreasing amount of room that they've had to live in within the past 70 years, you can only imagine that there's conflict. So there's ongoing conflict between the Arabs and Israelis in this region because both groups believe that they have a right to the same land of Israel. And this land is Israel. And once again, this is a globe view of it. And where the arrow is pointing is about approximately Israel. This is a close-up of the disputed land. Okay. Now, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all share a common ancestry from Abraham and a common place of origin. And we'll take a look at how that occurs. We see Abraham has two sons. His oldest son is Ishmael, and his youngest son is Isaac. Ishmael went on to become the father of the Arabs and Muslims, and Isaac went on to become the father of the Hebrews, who eventually branched off into the religions of Judaism and Christianity. And this is the Jerusalem conflict, kind of a summary or an analogy for the Jerusalem conflict. And let's just pretend this, okay? Let's pretend that this is a new law. Put yourself in this position. A new law has been passed, and inheritance rights can only be given to one child within a family. Now, the person in this family, or the father in this family, has 3 sons. All of the children belong to the same father. However, 2 of the children have the same mother, and 1 child belongs to a different mother. So who gets the family land and why? Remember, they're saying, I know you and I will probably think, well, why don't we just split the land up between 3 people, 3 sons? No. For the purposes of this discussion, only 1 child can get the land. Which child do you feel deserves the land? Well, let's kind of talk about this. Which religion is actually the oldest? Judaism is older than both Christianity and Islam. And maybe we'll think about now, this is different though. Which son of Abraham is the oldest? Ishmael, the father of Islam, is actually the oldest son. So this sounds like as you can see, this is a very complex problem. And its roots, the root of the problem goes back to the founding of the 3 major monotheistic religions. So this conflict, it goes back literally thousands of years. And so the 2 questions we have to decide is, who gets the Holy Land? The Jews or the Muslims? Better yet, even better question, who gets to decide? Who gets to be the judge of who gets the land? Okay, you guys, remember, answer the questions in bold lettering, highlight the answers to your homework learning targets. The end. Have a good evening. See you in class.